The merciless Texas sun blazed overhead, like a forge left burning too long, casting harsh shadows across the desolate landscape outside San Angelo. In the summer of 1890, the heat was more than oppressive. It was a living thing that pressed down on everything it touched, turning the air thick and suffocating. Flies buzzed in lazy circles around the half-collapsed horse stable, their droning a constant reminder of decay and neglect. Inside that crumbling structure, tied to a weathered wooden post with rope that bit deep into her flesh, Clara Hayes fought against despair with every labored breath. At 23, Clara had known hardship drought seasons that left crops withered, harsh winters that claimed cattle the endless struggle of ranch life in Texas. But nothing had prepared her for this. The rope around her wrists had been pulled so tight that her hands had long since gone numb, purple and swollen. Blood trickled from where the coarse fibers had worn through her skin, attracting more flies to the scene of her torment. Her left eye was swollen completely shut, a grotesque purple bulge that throbbed with each heartbeat. The right side of her face bore the livid mark of a backhanded slap, the kind that left your ears ringing for hours. Her white cotton dress, the same one she'd worn to church just 3 days ago, when the world still made sense, now hung in tatters. The fabric was torn at the shoulder, exposing scraped skin beneath, and ripped up to her hip, where rough hands had grabbed and pulled. But it wasn't the physical pain that threatened to break her. It was the suffocating weight of fear that pressed against her chest like a boulder. The kind of terror that makes your lungs forget how to work properly, that turns your blood to ice even in the blazing heat. She'd heard what these men were capable of, had seen the aftermath of their visits to other ranches. Women who crossed their path were often found weeks later, if they were found at all. Please, God, she prayed silently, her cracked lips barely moving. Please let someone find me before. She couldn't finish the thought, wouldn't let herself imagine what would happen when they returned. Clara had fought them initially, Lord knows she had. The rope burns on her forearms told the story of her desperate struggle. The raw patches where she'd twisted and pulled until her strength gave out. Her knees were scraped bloody from repeatedly trying to stand to find some position that might ease the agony in her shoulders. But now, after what felt like days in this hellish place, her body hung limp against the post, her muscles cramped and useless. Through her one good eye, she stared at the stable's doorway, where broken slats of wood created a pattern of light and shadow on the dirt floor. Each time a cloud passed over the sun, each time the light shifted, her heart would leap with desperate hope. Maybe this time it would be her father. Maybe this time it would be the sheriff from town. Maybe this time it would be anyone with the decency to cut her free. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the buzzing flies and her own shallow breathing. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight, coating everything in a fine layer of grit, her torn dress, her matted hair, the tears she refused to let fall. She was Clara Hayes, daughter of Henry Hayes, and Hayes women didn't break, not even when the world seemed determined to crush them. But as the sun climbed higher and her hope began to flicker like a candle in the wind, she found herself wondering if courage alone would be enough to see her through this trial. It was into this tableau of suffering that Elias Carter first stepped, though he couldn't have known that this moment would change the course of his solitary life forever. Elias had ridden out that morning with no particular destination in mind, a habit he'd developed since Margaret's death 5 years ago. The loneliness of his ranch could become overwhelming, pressing in on him like the walls of a tomb. And sometimes the only cure was to saddle up his horse and ride until the ache in his chest subsided to a manageable level. At 51, Elias Carter was a man carved from the harsh landscape he called home. Years of working cattle and fighting the elements had built broad shoulders and strong hands, though his dark hair was now threaded with silver and deep lines had settled around his weathered eyes. He'd loved once deeply and completely, and when that love had been torn away from him, something vital had gone with it. Margaret Carter had been the light of his world, a woman with honey gold hair and a laugh that could chase away the darkest thoughts. They'd built their ranch together, stone by stone, dream by dream. She'd died in the winter of 1885, supposedly from pneumonia. Though Elias had always harbored dark suspicions about the timing of her illness, coming as it did, just after she'd refused to sell their water rights to a certain wealthy landowner. Since then, Elias had lived like a ghost, haunting his own life, going through the motions of ranching, but finding little joy in work that had once filled him with purpose. He kept mostly to himself, speaking only when necessary, trusted by his neighbors, but known by few. The old stable where he'd tied his horse to rest in whatever shade he could find had once belonged to the Morrison family before they'd packed up and left for California. Like so many abandoned places in Texas, it had fallen into disrepair, forgotten by everyone, except the occasional drifter looking for shelter. Elias had expected to find nothing more than rotting wood and old hay. What he found instead changed everything. The sight that greeted him as he pushed open the warped stable door drove the air from his lungs as surely as a kick to the chest. For a moment, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. It was too cruel, too brutal for even this hard land. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, the horrible reality became undeniable. The young woman tied to the post raised her head at the sound of his footsteps, and when her one good eye met his, Elias saw something that cut him deeper than any physical wound ever could. It wasn't just pain he saw there, or even fear. It was the desperate, flickering hope of someone who had almost given up believing that rescue would come. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, the words barely audible. Clara tried to speak, her voice coming out as little more than a croak. Please help me." Elias was already moving his hands, reaching for the knife at his belt. Years of careful solitude of keeping his distance from other people's troubles evaporated in an instant. This wasn't about being neighborly or doing the right thing. This was about basic human decency, about the kind of evil that couldn't be ignored by any man with a conscience. "Easy now," he said softly, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "You're safe now. I'm going to cut you free." The rope was thick and had been tied with deliberate cruelty, designed not just to hold, but to cause maximum pain. As Elias worked with his blade, he could see the full extent of what had been done to this young woman. The bruises, the cuts, the way she trembled not just from pain, but from trauma that went deeper than physical wounds. When the last strand parted, Clara collapsed forward, her legs too weak to support her. Elias caught her before she could hit the ground, and the feel of her slight form in his arms awakened something protective he thought had died with Margaret. "I've got you," he murmured, lifting her as gently as he could. "You're safe now." As he carried her toward his horse, Clara managed to speak again, her voice still hoarse but growing stronger. My name is Clara Hayes." "Elias Carter," he replied, settling her carefully on his horse before mounting behind her. "We'll get you somewhere safe, Miss Hayes. I promise you that." The ride back to his ranch seemed to take forever, and no time at all. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, her body finally allowing itself to succumb to exhaustion, now that rescue had come. Elias found himself talking to her in low, soothing tones, the way he used to talk to Margaret during her final illness, anything to keep her anchored to consciousness, to life. By the time they reached the Carter Ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Elias's cabin was modest, but well-maintained, a testament to his methodical nature. Inside, the rooms were clean and sparse, furnished with the basics a solitary man needed, and nothing more. He settled Clara in the one comfortable chair he owned, then fetched water from the pump outside. She drank greedily, as if she hadn't tasted water in days, which might well have been the case. Color began to return to her pale cheeks, and her breathing became more regular. Thank you," she said finally, looking up at him with eyes that held depths of gratitude he wasn't sure he deserved. "I don't know how long I was in that place, but I was starting to think." "Don't think about what might have been," Elias said firmly. "You're here now and you're safe. That's all that matters." Clara nodded, then winced as the movement sent pain shooting through her bruised face. I need to tell you something, Mr. Carter. About why this happened. About who did this to me. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Her voice grew stronger, more determined. Because they won't stop with just me. And if you've helped me, that makes you a target too. Elias settled into the chair across from her, his expression serious. In the lamplight, he could see her more clearly now. Beneath the bruises and trauma was a beautiful young woman, with intelligent eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw that spoke of inner strength. Tell me, he said simply. Clara took a shuddering breath and began her story. My father is Henry Hayes. We have a ranch up in Wichita County, good land, with a creek that runs year-round and pasture that stays green even in drought years. It's been in our family for 15 years, since before I was born. Her voice grew bitter. That land caught the attention of a man named Grayson. Elias's jaw tightened at the name. He'd heard of Clayton Grayson, a man who'd built an empire on other people's misery, who bought judges and sheriffs the way other men bought cattle. Grayson made my father an offer for the land. A fair offer, he called it, though it was barely half what the ranch is worth. When Papa refused, Grayson got angry. He's not a man who's used to hearing the word no. Clara's hands trembled as she continued, but her voice remained steady. He came back a week later with a higher offer, but still nowhere near what the land is worth. Papa refused again. Grayson left, but he said Papa would change his mind soon enough. And then they took you. Elias said, understanding beginning to dawn. 3 days ago. I was checking on our cattle in the south pasture when they grabbed me. 4 men all wearing bandanas over their faces, but I recognized one of their voices, Luke Hanley. He used to work for us before Papa fired him for stealing. Clara's good eye blazed with anger. They didn't even try to hide what they were doing. They said I was insurance to make sure Papa saw reason. Insurance. Elias repeated, his voice hard as granite. They beat me when I tried to fight them off, then tied me in that stable and left me there. One of them said Grayson would let me go once Papa signed over the deed. Clara met his eyes. But I know men like Grayson, Mr. Carter. Once he has what he wants, people who've seen too much don't usually live to tell about it. Elias was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd told him. He'd suspected as much in Texas. Men like Grayson operated with impunity, using violence and intimidation to get what they wanted. The law was often for sale to the highest bidder, and decent people learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. But looking at this brave young woman, seeing what she'd endured, Elias felt something awakening in him that had been dormant for years. It was the same feeling he'd had when he'd first laid eyes on this land, when he decided to make his stand here, no matter what the cost. They'll be looking for you, he said finally. I know. And when they find out you helped me. Clara's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Let them come, Elias said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. This is my land, and no man has the right to terrorize innocents, not while I still draw breath. Clara studied his face in the lamplight, seeing something there that gave her hope. You don't understand, Mr. Carter. Grayson has money influence. He owns half the sheriffs in this part of Texas. Fighting him is like fighting the devil himself. Elias stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land he'd worked so hard to build into something worthwhile. In the distance, he could see the grave marker where Margaret lay, buried a simple wooden cross that he'd carved himself. Miss Hayes, he said without turning around. I learned a long time ago that some things are worth fighting for no matter the odds. Justice is one of them, and so is protecting those who can't protect themselves. When he turned back to her, Clara saw something in his weathered face that made her believe for the first time in days that she might actually survive this ordeal. But neither of them knew that their troubles were just beginning. The night settled over the Carter Ranch like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the familiar sounds of the Texas wilderness. Coyotes called to each other across the vast expanse of prairie, their voices rising and falling in an ancient song. Cattle lowed in the distance, and the windmill creaked steadily in the gentle breeze. But beneath these familiar sounds, Elias's experienced ears picked up something that didn't belong, the soft footfalls of someone trying very hard not to be heard. He'd been dozing in his chair, the old Colt revolver resting on the table beside him, when the sound woke him. Years of living alone on the frontier had honed his instincts to a razor's edge, and right now every one of them was screaming danger. Clara was asleep in his bed. He'd insisted she take it while he kept watch, but at the sound of creaking floorboards on the porch, her eyes snapped open. She'd learned to sleep lightly these past few days, always listening for the sound of approaching footsteps. "Someone's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elias nodded his hand, closing around the grip of his pistol. He'd been expecting this, though he'd hoped they'd have more time to prepare. Grayson's men wouldn't waste time once they discovered Clara was missing from the stable. The front door was solid oak, built to withstand both weather and unwanted visitors. But Elias had no illusions about how long it would hold against determined men. He motioned for Clara to stay back, then positioned himself where he'd have a clear line of sight to whoever came through that door. They didn't have to wait long. The door exploded inward with a crash that seemed to shake the entire cabin. Through the splintered opening stepped a man Elias recognized from Clara's description, Luke Hanley. Though he looked different from the young cowhand who'd once worked honest jobs around the county. Prison time in association with Grayson's gang had hardened him, given him the cold eyes of a killer. Well. Luke drawled, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun. "If it ain't Elias Carter playing the hero." His gaze shifted to Clara, who'd pressed herself against the back wall but refused to cower. "And there's our little runaway. Grayson's been mighty worried about you, darlin'. Get off my land," Elias said quietly, but his voice carried the unmistakable authority of a man who'd faced down his share of trouble. Luke laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Your land, old man. This whole county's gonna belong to Mr. Grayson soon enough. You're just too stubborn to see it yet. The only thing I see is a yellow-bellied coward who beats defenseless women." Elias replied, his finger moving to the trigger of his Colt. "That makes you lower than a snake in my book." The insult hit home. Luke's face darkened, and his casual demeanor evaporated. "You got a smart mouth for a man who's about to die. Hand over the girl, and maybe I'll make it quick." "Come and take her," Elias challenged. For a moment, the cabin was filled with the kind of silence that comes just before a thunderstorm breaks. Both men were experienced with violence. Both knew that the next few seconds would determine who walked away and who didn't. It was Clara who broke the deadlock. "Oh, behind you," she shouted, and Elias spun to see a second man climbing through the cabin's rear window. The warning saved his life. Luke drew his gun, but Elias was already moving, diving behind the heavy wooden table as bullets splintered the wood around him. The man at the window, a scarred brute Clara didn't recognize, fired twice before Elias's return shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing back through the window. Luke advanced his gun, smoking, confident that he had the older man pinned down. But Elias Carter hadn't survived this long by being predictable. Instead of staying behind cover, he rolled to his left, coming up behind the cast-iron stove. "You're finished, old man," Luke shouted. "Just like your wife was finished when she wouldn't listen to reason." The words hit Elias like a physical blow, confirming suspicions he'd carried for 5 long years. Margaret hadn't died of pneumonia. She'd been murdered, just like he'd always feared. The rage that had been simmering in his chest suddenly blazed into an inferno. Luke realized his mistake too late. He'd expected his revelation to break the older man's spirit, but instead, it had unleashed something terrible. Elias came around the stove like an avenging angel, his face a mask of controlled fury. The two men collided in the center of the cabin, Luke's gun flying from his hand as Elias tackled him to the floor. For a moment, they grappled, Luke trying desperately to reach his fallen weapon, while Elias used his superior weight and leverage to pin him down. But Luke was younger and more desperate. He managed to pull a knife from his boot, slashing wildly at Elias's face. The blade caught the older man across the cheek, opening a line of fire that immediately began to bleed. Clara screamed, but Elias barely felt the pain. All he could think about was Margaret, about the nights he'd sat by her bedside, watching her waste away, never knowing that her suffering was caused by poison rather than disease. With a roar of anguish and rage, Elias grabbed Luke's wrist and slammed it against the floor until the knife went skittering away. Then he hauled the younger man to his feet and drove him back against the cabin wall with enough force to rattle the windows. "You killed her," Elias said, his voice deadly quiet. "You killed my Margaret." Luke's eyes were wide with sudden fear. He'd expected to find a broken-down old rancher, not this force of nature driven by righteous fury. I didn't. Grayson said it would look natural. The confession sealed his fate. Elias drew back his fist and drove it into Luke's solar plexus with all the force he could muster. The younger man doubled over, gasping for air, and Elias followed up with an uppercut that snapped his head back and sent him sliding down the wall to sit in a dazed heap on the floor. "Clara," Elias called, not taking his eyes off Luke. "Check his pockets. I want to know what else this snake is carrying." Clara moved carefully around the destruction in the cabin, her hands shaking as she searched through Luke's vest and pants. What she found made her gasp. "Mr. Carter, look at this." She held up a thick roll of bills bound with a bank wrapper. Even in the dim lamplight, they could both see the distinctive marking of the Wichita County Bank, Grayson's Bank. "Payment for services rendered," Elias said grimly. "This is evidence, Miss Hayes. Proof that Grayson ordered your kidnapping." Luke groaned and tried to sit up straighter, blood trickling from his split lip. "You think that matters? You think anyone's gonna believe some broken-down rancher over Clayton Grayson?" "Maybe not," Elias admitted. "But they might believe it when it comes from your own mouth." "I ain't saying nothing," Luke mumbled. Elias smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Oh, I think you will. You see, Luke, I just learned that you helped murder my wife. That gives me a powerful incentive to extract the truth from you, one way or another." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Luke's defiance crumbled. He'd seen what happened to men who crossed Elias Carter when his blood was up. The older man might be past 50, but he was still as dangerous as a cornered wolf. All right, Luke said quickly. "I'll tell you what you want to know. Just don't hurt me no more." And so, in the wreckage of his cabin with Clara as witness, Elias finally learned the truth about Margaret's death and the scope of Grayson's crimes. It was worse than he'd imagined, a web of corruption and violence that stretched back years and touched dozens of lives. But as Luke spilled his secrets, none of them noticed the shadow that moved past the broken window or heard the soft footfalls retreating into the night. Grayson's third man had escaped, and he was already riding hard toward town with news of the night's failure. The real battle was just beginning. Dawn came slowly to the Texas plains, the sky lightening from black to deep purple, to the pale gold of early morning. Elias stood on his porch surveying the damage from the night's fight. His cabin would need extensive repairs, and the door hung askew on its hinges. Glass from the broken window littered the floor, and there were bullet holes in his walls that would serve as permanent reminders of how close they'd all come to death. Luke Hanley sat tied to a chair on the porch, his face a map of bruises and his spirit thoroughly broken. Throughout the long night, he told them everything about Grayson's plans to acquire every ranch in the county, about the judges and sheriffs on his payroll, about the accidents that had befallen other ranchers who'd refused to sell. Most painfully, he'd confirmed Elias's worst fears about Margaret's death. She'd been poisoned slowly over the course of weeks, by a dose of arsenic slipped into the well water. It had been meant to look like a wasting disease, and it had worked perfectly until now. Clara emerged from the cabin, carrying a cup of coffee, moving more easily than she had the night before. Rest and medical attention had done her good, though the bruises on her face would take weeks to fade completely. "How are you feeling?" Elias asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Better," she said and meant it. "Stronger, ready to fight." "This isn't your fight, Miss Hayes. I can take you to town, get you somewhere safe." "No." Her voice was firm, brooking no argument. "They made it my fight when they tied me to that post and left me to die. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "someone needs to watch your back. You proved last night that you're not as young as you used to be." Elias touched the bandage on his cheek where Luke's knife had caught him. She was right. 20 years ago, he would have ended that fight much more quickly. But he'd won, and that was what mattered. "They'll be back," he said, scanning the horizon. Luke wasn't working alone, and his partner, who escaped, will have reported back to Grayson by now. "How many men does Grayson have?" Clara asked. "Too many," Luke said from his chair, speaking for the first time since confessing. "You ain't got a chance against him. He's got gunfighters from as far away as El Paso men who kill for sport." "Then we'll have to be smarter than they are," Elias replied calmly. As if summoned by his words, dust appeared on the horizon, multiple riders approaching at speed. Elias counted at least 6 men, all armed, and riding with the purposeful determination of those who'd come to finish a job. "Clara, get inside and stay down," he ordered, checking his rifle. "I'm not hiding," she said stubbornly. "This isn't about hiding, it's about tactics. I need to know you're safe so I can concentrate on the fight." She saw the logic in his words, but before she could respond, the riders were close enough to make out individual faces. What she saw made her blood run cold. Leading the group was a man she recognized from the bank in town, Clayton Grayson himself, dressed in his expensive Eastern clothes, but wearing a gun belt that looked well used. Beside him rode 3 men who had the look of professional killers, their eyes cold and their movements economical. "Well, well," Grayson called out as he reined in his horse just outside pistol range. "Elias Carter, I should have known you'd stick your nose where it doesn't belong." The Grayson. Elias replied evenly. "Come to collect your pet snake, among other things." Grayson's gaze shifted to Clara, who had ignored Elias's advice and remained on the porch. "Miss Hayes, I'm disappointed in you. All of this unpleasantness could have been avoided if you'd simply stayed where you were put. In that stable tied up like an animal." Clara's voice shook with anger. "I'd rather die first." "That can be arranged," said one of Grayson's gunmen, a lean man with pale eyes and scars on his hands. "Enough talk," Grayson said impatiently. "Carter, you have something that belongs to me. Return the girl and Luke, and maybe I'll let you live long enough to sell me this worthless piece of dirt you call a ranch." "The girl belongs to herself," Elias replied. "And Luke's got some interesting stories to tell about your business practices. I think the territorial marshal would be very interested in hearing them." Grayson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The marshal? You mean Tom Bradshaw? He's been on my payroll for 3 years. Face facts, Carter, you're alone out here. No one's coming to help you." "Maybe so," Elias conceded. "But I'm not going down without a fight." "And then you'll die," Grayson said simply. "Boys, burn them out." What followed was unlike the previous night's desperate struggle. This was warfare pure and simple, with Grayson's men using military tactics to assault the ranch. 2 of them circled wide to approach from the rear, while the others provided covering fire from the front. Elias had prepared for this possibility. During the long night hours, he'd moved ammunition and supplies to strategic positions around his property, turning the ranch into a fortress of sorts. When the first gunman tried to rush the porch, Elias was ready for him. The rifle shot echoed across the plains like thunder, and the gunman pitched backward off his horse. But there were still 5 more, and they were spreading out trying to surround the cabin. "Clara," Elias shouted. "The barn, run for the barn." She understood immediately. The barn offered better cover and multiple escape routes if things went badly. She sprinted across the open ground between the cabin and the barn bullets, kicking up dust around her feet, but somehow making it safely to cover. From the barn's hayloft, Clara had an excellent view of the entire ranch. She could see Grayson directing his men, could see them moving to surround Elias's position. What she also saw was something that gave her an idea, a dangerous, desperate idea, but possibly their only chance. The barn contained not just hay and farm equipment, but also several barrels of kerosene that Elias used for his lamps. If she could somehow turn those barrels into weapons. Meanwhile, Elias was discovering that 6-to-1 odds were even worse than they sounded. No matter how good a shot he was, he couldn't be in 6 places at once. A bullet shattered the window beside him, sending glass flying, and another punched through the cabin wall just inches from his head. He needed to change the dynamics of the fight, and fast. That's when he heard Clara's voice calling from the barn. "Mr. Carter, when I give the signal, shoot the big oak tree by the corral." The oak tree. Elias looked across the yard, and understanding dawned. The tree was directly between 2 of Grayson's men and the barn. If it fell, it would either crush them or force them into the open. "Ready?" Clara called, and Elias saw smoke beginning to pour from the barn's back door. She'd set fire to something probably hay-soaked in kerosene, and the wind was carrying the smoke directly toward Grayson's men. Within moments, the entire area was filled with thick, choking smoke that made accurate shooting impossible. "Now!" Clara shouted. Elias put 3 shots into the base of the oak tree, right where an old lightning strike had weakened it years ago. The massive trunk groaned, swayed, and then crashed down with a thunderous impact that shook the ground. It didn't kill anyone, but it scattered Grayson's men and gave Elias the opening he needed. He burst from the cabin and made it to the barn, just as the smoke was beginning to clear. "Clever girl," he panted as he joined Clara in the hayloft. "It's not over yet," she replied, pointing toward the front of the property. Grayson himself was dismounting a rifle in his hands, a murder in his eyes. The pretense of civilization had been stripped away, revealing the savage underneath. "Carter," he roared, "you've cost me good men. Now I'm going to finish this personally." But as Grayson stalked toward the barn, he failed to notice that Luke Hanley, still tied to his chair on the cabin porch, was shouting something. The words were lost in the wind and smoke, but his meaning became clear when riders appeared on the horizon. Not more of Grayson's men, but townspeople from San Angelo. Someone had heard the gunfire and come to investigate. The tide of battle had suddenly dramatically turned. The group approaching from town wasn't large, perhaps a dozen men, but they rode with purpose and authority. At their head was Sheriff Marcus Webb, a man Elias recognized, but had never particularly trusted. Webb had always seemed too comfortable with the status quo, too willing to look the other way when powerful men bent the law to their purposes. But today, something was different. Today, Webb rode like a man with a mission. Grayson saw them coming too, and for the first time since the fight began, uncertainty flickered across his face. He was far from town on another man's property with dead bodies and evidence of a gun battle scattered around him. Even his bought and paid for sheriff might find this hard to explain away. "Stand down," Webb called out as he and his men surrounded the ranch yard. "Everyone drop your weapons." "Sheriff," Grayson said smoothly, immediately shifting back into his civilized persona. "Thank God you're here. This madman Carter attacked my men without provocation. He's holding Miss Hayes against her will." But before Webb could respond, Clara stepped out of the barn, very much in control of her own actions. "That's a lie," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the yard. "Mr. Grayson had me kidnapped and beaten. Mr. Carter saved my life. Now, Miss Hayes, Grayson said in what he probably thought was a fatherly tone, you're obviously confused. You've been through a trauma. I'm not confused about anything, Clara interrupted. And I have proof. She held up the roll of bills they'd taken from Luke Hanley, still bound with the Wichita County bank wrapper. This is the money your man was paid to kidnap me. Luke Hanley confessed to everything, including my kidnapping and the murder of Margaret Carter 5 years ago. A murmur ran through the assembled townspeople. Margaret Carter had been well liked, and her death had been widely mourned. If she'd been murdered, as Grayson snarled, his composure finally cracking, the word of a known criminal and a hysterical woman against the word of Clayton Grayson. The voice came from an unexpected source, Sheriff Webb himself. That's interesting, Clayton, because I've been doing some investigating of my own. Webb reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a thick folder. Seems the Territorial Marshal's office has been getting complaints about you for months. Ranchers whose wells mysteriously went bad right before you made them offers. Businessmen who found themselves in legal trouble right after they crossed you. Witnesses who disappeared before they could testify. Grayson's face had gone pale, but he tried one more time to bluff his way out. Sheriff, surely you don't believe... What I believe, Webb said firmly, is that you've been running this county like your personal kingdom for too long. And that ends today. What happened next would be talked about in San Angelo for years to come. Grayson, seeing his empire collapsing around him, made a desperate play for his gun. But he was a businessman, not a gunfighter, and his hand had barely touched his weapon when Elias's rifle cracked from the barn loft. The shot took Grayson in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him to the ground. It wasn't a killing shot Elias had aimed to wound, not to execute, but it ended any resistance the man might have offered. The remaining gunmen, seeing their employer down and outnumbered 3-1, wisely chose surrender over a futile battle. As the smoke cleared and the dust settled, Elias climbed down from the barn loft, feeling every one of his 51 years. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the fight was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. But there was also something else, a sense of justice finally served, of wrongs finally made right. Clara met him at the bottom of the ladder, her eyes bright with tears of relief and gratitude. "It's over," she said softly. "Yes," he agreed, looking around at the captured gunman and the wounded Grayson. "It's over." Sheriff Webb approached them, his expression apologetic. "Mr. Carter, Miss Hayes, I owe you both an apology. I should have acted on these suspicions months ago. What matters is that you acted when it counted," Elias replied. As the prisoners were loaded into wagons for the trip back to town, one of the townspeople approached Elias. It was Dr. Samuel Morrison, whose family had once owned the stable where Clara had been held. "Mr. Carter," Morrison said, "I want you to know that what you did today, standing up to Grayson, protecting Miss Hayes, it took real courage. This whole county owes you a debt." Others echoed his sentiment, and Elias found himself surrounded by people offering their thanks and support. It was more human contact than he'd had in years, and it felt strange, but not unwelcome. But it was Clara's quiet presence beside him that meant the most. As the dust of the departing wagons settled and the last of the townspeople rode away, Elias and Clara found themselves alone on the ranch for the first time since the nightmare had begun. The silence that fell between them was different from the tense quiet of the past few days. This was peaceful, contemplative. The kind of silence that comes after a storm has finally passed. Clara walked slowly around the ranch yard, taking in the damage with new eyes. The fallen oak tree, the bullet holes in the cabin walls, the bloodstains on the porch, all evidence of how close they'd come to losing everything. But there was something else she saw. Something that spoke to her heart in ways she was only beginning to understand. This place, with all its scars and imperfections, felt like home. "You're thinking awfully hard about something," Elias observed, joining her beside the well. I was thinking about courage, Clara said softly. About what it really means. Elias raised an eyebrow. And what conclusion did you reach? That real courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, despite being terrified. She looked up at him, her eyes serious. You were afraid yesterday, weren't you? When you first saw Grayson's men riding toward the ranch. Elias considered lying, maintaining the stoic facade he'd worn for so many years. But looking at Clara, seeing the genuine interest and understanding in her face, he found himself telling the truth instead. Terrified, he admitted. Not for myself particularly, but for you. The thought of them taking you again, of what they might do. He shook his head. I haven't felt fear like that since Margaret was dying. But you fought anyway. Some things are worth fighting for no matter the cost. Clara was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had been weighing on her mind since the battle ended. What happens now, Mr. Carter? I mean, really. Grayson's finished Luke's going to prison, but what about us? What about you and me? It was the question Elias had been dreading because it forced him to confront feelings he'd been trying to ignore. Over the past few days, watching Clara's courage in the face of unimaginable trials, seeing her intelligence and strength and kindness, he'd felt something awakening in his heart that he'd thought died with Margaret. But she was 23 years old, barely more than half his age. She had her whole life ahead of her, opportunities he couldn't even imagine. What right did he have to burden her with the affections of a broken-down widower? You should go home to your father, he said finally. He'll be worried sick and you belong with your family. That's not what I asked, Clara said gently but firmly. I asked what happens to us. There is no us, Miss Hayes. You're a young woman with your whole life ahead of you. I'm a 51-year-old widower with more ghosts than future. You deserve better than... Don't. Clara's voice cut through his self-deprecation like a knife. Don't you dare tell me what I deserve or don't deserve. I'm a grown woman, Mr. Carter, and I think I'm capable of making my own decisions about my life. Elias looked at her in surprise. He'd seen her courage in battle. But this was different. This was the courage to fight for what she wanted regardless of what others might think was proper or sensible. Clara, my father has a saying, she interrupted. He says that life is like a wild horse. You can spend your time being afraid of getting thrown, or you can climb on and see where it takes you. She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. I've been thrown, Mr. Carter. Badly. But I'm ready to climb back on. You don't know what you're saying, Elias said, but his voice lacked conviction. Don't I? Clara reached up and touched the bandage on his cheek, her fingers gentle against his weathered skin. I know that in the space of 3 days, you've shown me more genuine care and protection than some people experience in a lifetime. I know that you risked everything, your life, your home, your peace to save a stranger. I know that when I was at my lowest point, when I thought I might not survive another day, you appeared like an answer to prayer. Elias felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. Clara, I'm not a young man. I'm set in my ways, scarred by loss. So am I, she said simply. Grayson's men didn't just beat my body, Mr. Carter. They tried to break my spirit, tried to make me believe that I was powerless, worthless. But you showed me different. You showed me that I'm worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth loving. The last words were barely a whisper, but they hit Elias like a thunderbolt. For a moment he stood frozen, afraid to believe what he was hearing, afraid to hope for something he'd thought lost forever. You don't love me, he said finally. You're grateful, and that's understandable, but... Elias Carter, Clara said, using his first name for the first time. If you tell me one more time what I do or don't feel, I'm going to have to get violent. Despite everything, Elias found himself smiling. "You're threatening me, Miss Hayes? Only if you keep being deliberately obtuse," she replied, but she was smiling too. "I know the difference between gratitude and love, Mr. Carter. Gratitude is what I feel towards Sheriff Webb for finally doing his job. Love is what I feel when I look at you and see a man who spent 5 years punishing himself for his wife's death, who's lived like a hermit because he couldn't bear the thought of losing someone again." Elias felt tears stinging his eyes. How had she seen so clearly through the barriers he'd built around his heart? "Love is what I feel." Clara continued, "When I imagine what it would be like to help you heal from that pain, to show you that opening your heart again doesn't dishonor Margaret's memory, it honors it. She loved you, didn't she?" "Completely and deeply, yes," Elias whispered. "Then she would want you to be happy again. She would want you to live, really live, not just exist." Clara's hand was still on his cheek, and he found himself leaning into her touch despite himself. "I'm not trying to replace her, Elias. I couldn't and I wouldn't want to. But maybe I could help you build something new. Something different, but just as precious." For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of possibility hanging between them like morning mist. Elias thought about Margaret, about the love they'd shared, and the dreams they'd built together. But for the first time in 5 years, thinking about his late wife didn't bring only pain. It brought gratitude for what he'd had, and hope for what he might have again. "I'm scared," he admitted finally, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "So am I," Clara replied. "But maybe we can be scared together." And then, as natural as breathing, Elias was kissing her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as if he were afraid she might disappear if he held her too tightly. But Clara kissed him back with a fervor that spoke of deep feeling of a woman who knew her own mind and wasn't afraid to claim what she wanted. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Elias felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. "I love you too," he said quietly, the words feeling strange and wonderful on his tongue. "God help me, I do." Clara's smile was radiant. "Then what happens now is we figure out how to build a life together. Your father will be thrilled to know that his daughter is in love with the man who saved her life." Clara said confidently, "Trust me, Papa's a good judge of character. Once he meets you properly, he'll see what I see." "And what's that?" "A good man who's been alone too long," Clara said simply. "A man worth loving." 3 days later, a wagon rolled up the dusty road toward the Carter Ranch, kicking up clouds of dust in the afternoon heat. Elias, who had been repairing the damage to his cabin, looked up to see a man of about his own age climbing down from the driver's seat. Even before Clara came running from the garden where she'd been helping him plant new vegetables, Elias knew this had to be Henry Hayes. The resemblance between father and daughter was unmistakable. The same determined set to the jaw, the same intelligent brown eyes, the same way of carrying themselves that spoke of inner strength and dignity. "Papa." Clara called, her voice filled with joy as she threw herself into her father's arms. Henry Hayes held his daughter tight, his eyes closed, his weathered face showing the strain of the past week. When he finally released her, his gaze shifted to Elias, who had approached respectfully, but remained at a distance, allowing the family reunion to proceed uninterrupted. "Mr. Carter," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't have adequate words to thank you for what you've done. When Sheriff Webb told me the whole story..." He shook his head, unable to finish. "Any decent man would have done the same, Mr. Hayes," Elias replied, offering his hand. Henry gripped it firmly, studying Elias's face with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to judge character quickly and accurately. What he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because his expression warmed considerably. "Sheriff Webb also told me some interesting things about how my daughter conducted herself during the fight." Henry continued, glancing at Clara with obvious pride. Seems she's got more of her mother's spirit than I realized. She saved my life at least twice, Elias said honestly. You raised a remarkable woman, Mr. Hayes. I did my best, but I suspect she was remarkable all on her own. Henry's gaze shifted between Elias and Clara, and something knowing flickered in his eyes. I also suspect there are some things we need to discuss. Clara blushed, but lifted her chin defiantly. Papa, Mr. Carter and I have fallen in love. Henry finished calmly. Yes, daughter, it's written all over both your faces. The question is, what do you intend to do about it? Elias stepped forward, his expression serious. Mr. Hayes, I know this is sudden, and I know there are practical considerations, such as the fact that you're nearly 30 years older than my daughter. Henry asked bluntly. Yes, sir, among other things. Henry was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving around the ranch, taking in the signs of recent battle, but also the evidence of hard work and careful stewardship. The cattle in the pasture were fat and healthy, the buildings well maintained despite the recent damage, the land itself showing signs of being worked by someone who understood and respected it. Mr. Carter, he said finally, I've been ranching for more than 20 years. In that time, I've learned that the most important thing about a man isn't his age, it's his character. And from what I've seen and heard, you're a man of exceptional character. Elias felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. That said, Henry continued, I have some concerns. Not about your worthiness that's been proven beyond doubt, but about practicalities. Clara's young, full of dreams and ambitions. Are you prepared for the possibility that she might change her mind, that she might decide she wants different things than what you can offer? It was a fair question, and one that had been haunting Elias's own thoughts. I've considered that, sir, and if it happens, I'll let her go without a fight. Her happiness matters more to me than my own. That's exactly the answer I was hoping for, Henry said with a slight smile. Because it tells me you love her for the right reasons. Clara, who had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience, finally spoke up. This is all very touching, but don't I get a say in this conversation? I'm not a piece of property to be negotiated over. Both men looked at her in surprise, then had the grace to look sheepish. You're absolutely right, daughter, Henry said. What do you want? I want to marry Elias. Clara said without hesitation. I want to help him rebuild this ranch, to build a life with him here. I want to have his children and grow old beside him and prove to everyone, including both of you, that love doesn't always follow the rules society thinks it should. Elias felt his heart swell with pride and love for this incredible woman who had somehow chosen him despite all the reasons she shouldn't have. And I want your blessing, Papa. Clara continued, her voice softening. Because you're the most important person in my life, and I can't be completely happy without knowing you approve. Henry Hayes looked at his daughter for a long moment, seeing not the little girl he'd raised, but the strong, determined woman she'd become. Then he looked at Elias, seeing the love and devotion shining in the older man's eyes. You have my blessing, he said finally. Both of you. And more than that, you have my friendship and support. Clara threw her arms around her father again, tears of joy streaming down her face. Over her shoulder, Henry extended his hand to Elias once more. Welcome to the family, son, he said quietly. The wedding took place 6 weeks later on a beautiful October morning, when the Texas heat had finally broken, and the air carried the first crisp promise of autumn. The ceremony was held at the small church in San Angelo, with what seemed like half the county in attendance. Sheriff Webb was there, along with Dr. Morrison, and dozens of other townspeople who had come to celebrate not just a wedding, but a victory over the forces that had terrorized their community for so long. Clayton Grayson was conspicuously absent, being permanently indisposed in the territorial prison, where he was serving a 25-year sentence for kidnapping conspiracy and accessory to murder. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Elias had picked himself from the meadow behind his ranch. Elias wore his best suit, a black wool outfit that he'd owned for years, but rarely had occasion to wear. At 51, he was still a handsome man, and the happiness that radiated from his face made him look years younger. The ceremony itself was simple, but moving. Pastor Williams, who had baptized Clara as an infant and confirmed her as a teenager, spoke about the mysterious ways of providence, about how God could bring good from even the darkest circumstances. He talked about the courage it takes to love again after loss and the blessing of finding someone who sees your true worth even when you can't see it yourself. When it came time for the vows, Clara spoke first, her voice clear and strong, as she promised to love Elias through whatever trials might come, to stand beside him as he'd stood beside her to build with him a future worthy of the love they'd found. Elias's vows were simpler, but no less heartfelt. He promised to cherish and protect Clara for all the days of his life, to honor her courage and independence, and to never take for granted the precious gift of her love. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed by a congregation that had seen the power of love to transform lives and overcome seemingly impossible odds. The celebration that followed was held at the Hayes Ranch, which had been restored to its former prosperity with the help of neighbors who were grateful to be free of Grayson's shadow. Tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by every woman in the county, and the dancing continued well into the night under stars that seemed brighter than usual. But eventually the guests departed, and the newlyweds were alone, driving back to what was now their shared home in Elias's wagon. The night was peaceful, filled with the familiar sounds of the Texas prairie, and Clara found herself thinking about how much her life had changed in just a few short months. "Any regrets?" Elias asked softly, as if reading her thoughts. Clara considered the question seriously. She thought about the comfortable life she'd left behind at her father's ranch, about the conventional path she might have followed if Grayson's men had never kidnapped her. She thought about the challenges that lay ahead, the age difference that would always exist between her and Elias, and the gossip they would face from narrow-minded neighbors, the uncertainty of building a life with someone who carried the scars of profound loss. "None," she said finally, and meant it completely. "What about you?" Elias thought about Margaret, about the guilt he'd carried for so long over her death, about the years of loneliness that had nearly consumed him. He thought about the risk he was taking in opening his heart again, about the possibility that lightning could strike twice, and he could lose Clara just as he'd lost his first wife. But then he looked at Clara sitting beside him, her face glowing with happiness in the moonlight, and felt nothing but gratitude for the unlikely series of events that had brought them together. "None," he echoed, reaching over to take her hand. "Not a single one." 5 years later, Elias Carter stood on the porch of the ranch house he'd built for Clara, watching his 3-year-old son chase chickens around the yard, while his infant daughter slept peacefully in her mother's arms. The house was larger than his old cabin, built to accommodate the family that had filled it with laughter and love, but it sat on the same spot where the original structure had stood, the place where their love story had truly begun. The ranch itself had prospered beyond his wildest dreams. With Clara's sharp mind for business complementing his knowledge of ranching, they'd expanded their holdings, improved their herds, and earned a reputation as one of the most successful operations in the county. But more importantly, they'd created a home filled with love, laughter, and the kind of deep contentment that comes from building something meaningful together. Henry Hayes was a frequent visitor, having developed an almost paternal affection for Elias and an obvious delight in his grandchildren. At 62, he showed no signs of slowing down, and often joked that becoming a grandfather had given him a new lease on life. The community itself had thrived since Grayson's downfall. New businesses had opened in San Angelo, honest men had been elected to positions of authority, and the atmosphere of fear that had once hung over the county like a dark cloud had been replaced by the kind of optimism that comes from believing in the possibility of justice. Luke Hanley had served his sentence, disappeared into the vastness of the American West, presumably to find some other way to make a living that didn't involve terrorizing innocent people. Elias occasionally wondered what had become of him, but mostly he was content to let the past remain in the past. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Clara asked, joining him on the porch with baby Margaret, named for Elias's first wife, a gesture that had moved him to tears when Clara suggested it. "Just counting my blessings," Elias replied, slipping his arm around his wife's waist and marveling, as he did every day, at the fact that she was really his. At 28, Clara had grown even more beautiful, her face showing the confidence and contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world. Motherhood suited her, but she'd also proven to be an invaluable partner in running the ranch, her quick mind and natural leadership abilities earning the respect of everyone who worked with them. "That's a dangerous habit," Clara said with a smile. "You might realize how lucky you are and start taking it for granted." "Never," Elias said seriously. "I wake up every morning amazed that this is my life, that you chose me, that we built all this together." Clara stood on her toes to kiss his cheek, careful not to wake the baby. "We did build it together, didn't we? From the ashes of what was lost, we made something new and beautiful." Young Henry, named for his grandfather, came running up to the porch, his face flushed with excitement. Papa, the chickens were chasing me." Elias scooped up his son, laughing at the boy's interpretation of events. "Were they now? How terrifying." "I wasn't scared," Henry declared stoutly. "Hayes men aren't scared of chickens." "That's right," Clara said proudly. "Hayes men and Carter men are brave." As the family settled on the porch to watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Elias reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. A kidnapping that should have ended in tragedy had instead become the catalyst for a love story that had transformed not just their lives, but an entire community. Margaret Carter had been right all those years ago. God never closed one door without opening another. Sometimes the doors were hidden, sometimes they opened in ways you'd never expect. But they were always there for those with the courage to walk through them. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara leaned against her husband's shoulder, their children safe in their arms, their future bright with possibility. They had faced the worst that life could throw at them and emerged stronger, their love tempered by trial and proven unbreakable. In the distance, a coyote called to the moon, its voice wild and free and full of life, just like the love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of circumstances, proving that even in the darkest of times, hope could take root and flourish. The Carter Ranch was more than just a piece of land now. It was a testament to the power of courage, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the miraculous ability of love to heal even the deepest wounds. And as long as the Texas wind blew across the prairie and the stars shone down on the land they'd claimed as their own, that testament would endure.